Kicking off hour number 2 here on Hurrdat Sports Radio. I'm Ravi, Lulla, Andrew Rogers here with me. We're live on AM 590, ESPN Omaha, ESPN Tri-Cities. Joining us now on the Warhorse Sportsbook Hotline is our guy, Mitch Sherman from The Athletic. Mitch, how are you today?
I'm well. Ravi, Andrew, how are you guys?
Good morning, man. Good to see you.
Morning.
We are doing well, coming off of a big national signing day for Nebraska. I know you've been covering Husker football for a long time. What, I guess, the Callahan years had some really good signing classes as well. I don't know if you go that far back. I guess, where does this kind of rank for you in terms of like off-season excitement levels that we've seen at Nebraska?
It's up there. I think just the Dylan Raiola, that one little narrative itself is in the top 2 or 3. It's hard to think of something that was more monumental than that for Nebraska to sign this quarterback. And it's not just that he's, a top 10 player nationally or was the number 1 prospect in this class for much of the cycle. It's that he's been on the radar for Nebraska for 2.5 years. I think that, and that he's named Raiola. I think that all bundled together makes that singular event of him committing on Monday and coming back into the picture last week and then signing yesterday. It was all just such a whirlwind thing because 2 weeks ago, we were not thinking about Dylan Raiola. We weren't talking about it. And I truly believe that neither was Matt Rule. The only connection that stayed within the Nebraska program to Dylan was his uncle. And I don't know that we'll ever hear. I mean, maybe if Dylan makes it to New York someday as a Heisman finalist, and I'm not setting that as the bar that he needs to reach, but if he wants to do that, that's
Heisman
fine.
or bust.
Yeah, that'd be a good story to cover. Maybe at that point, the questions would get probing enough with Donovan. Donovan is not super forthcoming with just like revealing personal details. Matt Rule is, and Matt Rule will tell you pretty much anything that he's thinking, at least as it fits his strategy, his communication strategy. Donovan Raiola's communication strategy is different than Matt Rule's. And while he has opened up some in his second year in the program, and I think is a friendly guy when you talk to him. It's not that he, and certainly he is with recruits and with people that he meets around the program, but he's not, I don't know that we'll ever hear from him exactly how he felt through this process. Like, honestly, from the time that Dylan committed to Georgia in May up until last Sunday when he's calling Matt Rule and Dominic Raiola is making phone calls to former players from his era to gauge what they think about the Nebraska program and what's happened in the 6 months that they've kind of been out of the loop. The only guy who stayed connected was Donovan, and he's a closed book when it comes to that. And it'll be really interesting to see if we ever find out exactly, were they playing the long game? And did he think all along, we just got to wait this thing out and wait until signing day comes and we're going to get back in with Dylan? I don't know the answer to that, but I tried to answer every other question that I could with the piece that's out today on The Athletic about how Nebraska pulled this off.
Yeah, Mitch, I wanted to bring up that piece that you wrote on The Athletic. I think you just tweeted it out about an hour ago on The Athletic. So if you're not a subscriber, you absolutely should be. But what were some of the things that you did find out, some of the tidbits that you did find out about how this came to be? You mentioned Dom kind of reaching out to former teammates and things like that. What were some of the little nuggets that you were able to uncover that were the most interesting to you without obviously spoiling your piece there?
No, I'm happy to spoil it.
Go subscribe to The Athletic anyway, but he's going to spoil it.
Well, I can't get into the details of 2,000 words, or we'll be talking for an hour. But Dominic, at the same time that Dylan reached out to Matt Rule on December 10th, this was a week ago Sunday, Dominic was doing his diligence behind the scene the scenes, and he connected with some former teammates, and one of them is Damon Benning, who of course well and have talked to about this on the show. I heard it driving in my car one day last week, and it got me thinking to talk to Damon. So thank you for that that little kick in the pants. And Damon shared some of the things with me that he shared with you, and we talked for quite a while about what Damon and Dom talked about on that Sunday, and it was interesting to hear how as their conversation developed and progressed, that Damon texted Matt Rule about it, and Matt Rule responded with the exclamation point emphasis, like yeah man, I know I'm hearing it too. Like, obviously I think Rule had some kind of a sense that something might be going on from his offensive line coach. And Dominic has talked to Jay Foreman. They were teammates at Nebraska in 97 and 98. Damon and Dom, their careers bumped up against each other. They weren't on the team at the same time, but Jay and Dom were, and they were close and have stayed close. And he was another confidant for Dominic through this process, and lended some advice, and he lended advice to Dylan too about the just the support system that he would have if Dylan did choose Nebraska. But not just on the coaching staff. Of course, he has his uncle on the coaching staff, and he has people like Jay in the community around Nebraska, around Lincoln, who are there for him if he needs something that he doesn't feel comfortable going to his position coach or his head coach about, and he needs to talk to somebody outside the program. There's options for Dylan to go to numerous people in the community here, and just how valuable that is. And he also emphasized to Dylan, Jay did, that there's an opportunity for Dylan here at Nebraska that Jay didn't have at Nebraska, that Dominic didn't have at Nebraska, that Donovan didn't have when he played in college at Wisconsin, that Jay's father, Chuck Foreman, didn't have when he played in college and he was an NFL player like Dominic. And that is to be someone who comes in and changes a program. When those guys that I mentioned who played at Nebraska walked in the 90s, Nebraska was already at a certain level, and they helped elevate the program, but it wasn't necessarily a program altering, program changing type of player. Tommy Frazier, he did that for Nebraska, but Dominic showed up 5 years later. They'd already won national championships. So it's hard to say how much that all swayed Dylan. I think in the end, there were a lot of factors, and the biggest one was that, like he said, this is family. This is in his blood. I got a tremendous sense of that when I was in Phoenix in February and talked to all of them about just what motivates them, why they do what they do, why Dylan has worked so hard at football over the years and studied it and poured himself into the game. And so much of it came back to family. I left those conversations, 9 or 10 months ago, thinking that he was going to end up at Nebraska. It took a route that not everyone foresaw, but the fact that he's here now, looking back at that, it doesn't surprise me.
Mitch, as you kind of take a look at the quarterback room as a whole now, with the addition of Dylan Raiola and Danny Kalen, you see Chubba Purdy enters the transfer portal last night. Obviously, Jeff Sims has already entered the transfer portal as well for Nebraska. So as you kind of take a deep dive into what they have right now, how are you assessing it? And then also, what do you think Nebraska is looking at right now in terms of adding maybe some veteran help, somebody with some games under their belt? Casey Thompson's name was tossed around a little bit last week and this week, but if it's not him and it's somebody in the portal, who do you think they're kind of eyeing up?
Yeah, well, Purdy leaving or getting ready to leave. He's not officially in the portal, but it's going to happen. His parents say it's happening. So that's about as good of a source as you can get on that one.
Right. I feel like I tell my parents most things, and the things I tell them.
If they're in the dark, then there's other problems. But that changes it. That changes the dynamic of the room for sure. You have two true freshmen and Heinrich Harburg, and you've got Luke Longball, who's a walk-on out of Iowa Western, and you've got Jack Wosch, who's a walk-on transfer from Ole Miss. It's a thin group, especially when you consider that two of those players have no experience at the college level. Now, Dylan comes in with a set of tools and skills and talent that are rare. But there is not a lot that you can trade for experience. Experience is the only way you can get it is by going out there and playing. And even if he's the starter on day one, it would benefit him a lot to have some people around him who have that experience. We heard yesterday that this Casey Thompson thing is at that point wasn't going anywhere, and the expectation was that he's not going to transfer back to Nebraska. I don't entirely close the door because I'll probably get a call when I'm done talking to you now. It's like, close the door. It's not happening. Quit talking
I
about
didn't close it either.
But hey, we heard that yesterday, and then Chuba goes in and decides to leave. When Matt Rule talked at 11:30 yesterday, he didn't sound like a guy who was expecting Chuba Purdy to leave. His name came up in the press conference, and I think that they expected or hoped, still hoped that they would have Chuba out there as a competitor in spring practice. So, but part of this has changed in the last 24 hours or 20 hours. So, okay, does that open the door for somebody like Casey? And if it's not Casey, then could you find somebody in the portal either now? Players can come out of the portal anytime. And there's this deadline in the first week of January to enter the portal. Mm-hmm. So whoever's in by January 4th or 5th, those are the only players you can get out until the spring. But then another period after spring practice in May exists for players to go in. I think they'll look. I think that it takes a unique player, mm-hmm. Because you're coming in alongside the 5-star recruit who is obviously seen as the future. And I don't know that there are a lot of veteran quarterbacks out there who are looking for a spot to come in and mentor freshmen. But maybe there's somebody with a connection to this coaching staff who understands, how they build and wants to get into coaching himself, who can fit that role. But it'll be a storyline to watch from now all the way up until May.
Mitch, how about outside of the quarterback position? I kind of want to marry what we opened up this whole segment with early signing day and the talk about the quarterback spot. In terms of areas of need, where do you think Nebraska has gotten better for next season, 1, and 2 for the future? Maybe it's the same for both.
Well, I think for the long-term future, they got better on the offensive line with this class. And, we don't know the exact breakdown of everything as it relates to, who's coming on scholarship and who's going to be on NIL assistance. And I guess it doesn't really matter because they signed 6 guys yesterday on the offensive line who are all scholarship worthy. And that's a big group of offensive linemen. I've seen it at 5 before, but 6 is a big group. And they need help at tackle. Right now, you've got Bryce Benhart and Teddy Prohaska in the program, and it looks good for your starting right and left tackle next season. But we've seen those guys, well, not Benhart, but we've certainly seen Teddy Prohaska suffer some injury issues. Mm-hmm. And you want to have some depth there. And depth is not necessarily going to come from your freshmen in the recruiting class. They do have Gunnar Gatula, who redshirted last year, who can play tackle. They might also look at him at guard if he's one of their top 5 guys on the line going into next season. It depends on how some things play out with players deciding to come back from injury or calling it a career. I'm looking at Ethan Piper. Turner Corcoran's also coming off of a big injury, and he's had multiple issues with his health too through his career. So we'll see how that progresses. But they got better on the offensive line for the long-term future. In the immediate present of what's happening right now, obviously quarterback is the biggest thing where they made a change with these 2 true freshmen and just overhauled the look of the group. I'd look at tight end and stay right there and bringing in some really dynamic guys. It's a different group of players too. You have 4 players, who are all some type of tight end. I've seen, Keelan Smith even listed as a wide receiver, but he's kind of a positionless player that Matt Rule talked about when he described Carter Nelson. Both of those guys, there ought to be ways in this offense, especially with the some of the issues with depth and experience that Nebraska has at wide receiver for them to come in and I think in Nelson's case, definitely help Nebraska right away. We'll see. Keelan Smith had a great senior season in Kansas City, and he played at a much higher level of football than what Carter Nelson did in 8-man in Nebraska. I'm interested to see with those two, and neither of them. Well, I know Nelson is not. Not sure on Smith, but I don't believe either of them are mid-year players. When they do get here, that there's going to be an opportunity for them to see how they fit into this program. And then Eric Ingerson and Ian Flint are more of your traditional tight ends. So with what Nebraska has coming back at that spot, and Thomas Fidone now having a full year under his belt, and Nate Borkricher coming back, and some younger players like Ismail Smith-Flores, I do think they got a lot better at that position too.
We're talking with Mitch Sherman from The Athletic. Mitch, you mentioned that offensive line group, and I'm fairly bullish on that group. They've signed, you mentioned the 6 guys in this class. They've signed 11 in the 2 recruiting classes that Coach Rule has brought in. I guess my question for you there is, how much do you think that positionless type of mentality translates to the offensive line as well? Because I know, we've talked about it with the tight ends. We've talked about it. Coach Rule talked about it with the defensive backs as well. We kind of have a lot of these guys. It's like, we're kind of worried about the tackle spots and we're not really sure here and there. Do you think they kind of apply that level of logic to, hey, we think these guys are athletic and move well and explosive, we're just going to put them out there? Like, how much do you think that applies to a spot like offensive line?
Well, I think they cross-train those guys, and they want them to be able to learn different spots. But especially at tackle, tackle's a tackle. And, I think you can be a tackle and play guard, but I don't think you can be a guard and play tackle effectively, especially if you've got a quarterback who needs time in the pocket and needs to be protected. If it's an option attack, a straightforward downhill running game, that's a different story. But in a pro-style offense, if you're going to throw it 30 times a game, if you're going to have a quarterback like Dylan Raiola or Daniel Kalen, who is more of a traditional pocket-style passer, I think you need offensive tackles who can match up against those elite pass-rushing defensive ends and backers who are coming off of the edge. So you can't just take a good athlete who's a positionless offensive lineman and stick him out there at left or right tackle and say, okay, go do your job. They've run into some issues when they've tried to do that in recent years. But yeah, there's a certain element to that absolutely on the inside of the offensive line. I mean, a guy like Justin Evans-Jenkins, he's positionless as far as it goes across the interior. He could ultimately be a center when Ben Scott's gone. He can back up Ben Scott. If something happens to Ben Scott, I think Justin Evans-Jenkins can step in there, but he can also start for you at guard. And they may take a guy who's a future tackle in the program. This is something that Iowa has done a lot in building their great offensive linemen and offensive lines. And they'll take someone who projects at tackle and ends up turning into a first-round draft pick as a tackle, and they'll play him at guard when they're a redshirt freshman or a sophomore. And I could see Nebraska doing something like that, as I mentioned a minute ago, with a player like Gunnar Gatula, or even Grant Bricks as he comes into the program. I mean, Grant Bricks, eventually he projects as a tackle because of his athleticism and his length and just the way that he can move. But as you get him ready, if he's somebody who can help you and you can put him at guard and he can move people in front of him, then great, put him out there.
Mitch, we heard you say already about the former players and how they've been kind of brought up in that conversation with Coach Rule yesterday in terms of, kind of like big recruiters for the university. They're the best ones to be able to hear from because they experienced what it was like to play football at Nebraska. Then you heard Coach Rule also mention Coach Osborne's name and saying that he's one of the best recruiters. Put him in a room with somebody and it's hard to tell Coach Osborne no. And I just think that was a cool piece because as the conversation went on during that press conference, and a listener pointed this out to me. You heard Rule say, we took a lot of safeties who we hope will rush the passer. We want to be the fastest team out there. And that's a lot what Coach Osborne did in the early 90s. I mean, just how much do you credit Coach Rule for being a lifelong learner and seeing that, hey, Coach Osborne made something work at Nebraska, and I think I can recreate it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about him that's great is that he doesn't close any doors to give himself opportunities to grow and to learn and to make himself better as a coach and a leader. I think a lot of people in various aspects of football or sports, they want to take a side. Often there's two different factions. There's two ways to see it. And, Matt Rule, I've seen over and over this first year at Nebraska is, he wants to be able to capitalize on everything that's available to him. And, if there's two camps and there's two ways of seeing things, like he's going to try to get both of those, take the positive elements of both of those and improve the Nebraska program. So yeah, the Osborne way of recruiting and of being open-minded to different schemes and his offense changed through his years. Osborne's did. His defense changed and evolved through his years. I think you see elements of that with Matt Rule. The defense that he ran in year one at Nebraska was considerably different than the defense that he ran when he was a young coach at Temple or when he was at Baylor. Some elements of it are the same, but he brought Tony White in. You learned from Tony White about what Tony wanted to do on the defensive side, and you saw the results in year one. It's exciting to think what year two can be in that defensive system because there should be a pretty big jump, and they're getting so many of the key pieces back. That philosophy of having safeties who can play like linebackers, it's something that Nebraska has used, of course, in some of its great defenses in the past. But that's a staple of the Tony White system, and you can see it in the way that they go out and recruit defensive backs. In both of these classes, and in what they added somewhat in the portal last year, there's so many of these athletes on the defensive side who you put into that DB group. And there are 5 defensive backs in the system. So I get it. It's almost half of the defense. So you expect there's going to be a lot of spots used, but they can, even yesterday on signing day, they just continue to add pieces to that defensive backfield. And it's like, does Evan Cooper just have carte blanche to be able to add what? And he's Matt Rule's talent evaluator, his top guy. So I get the sense like if he wants somebody, generally he gets that guy. Like he gets to pursue that guy. And they land a lot of them. So we're just starting to see the tip of the iceberg, I think, because most of the players who played in that secondary were veteran types. In 24, we're going to continue to see more of those young players emerge, and it'll be really interesting to see how all those pieces fit together.
All right, Mitch, you got 10 seconds here. I'm going to fit this one in quickly. I have to get a Christmas question into you. In a Christmas karaoke showdown, which holiday song would be your secret weapon?
For me to sing, that's not going to be a good idea in any situation. I don't know. I'll just go Silent Night, but I probably wouldn't be good at singing.
Silent Night. I love it, man.
Bringing the vibe down in the bar a little bit. Mitch Sherman, we appreciate it. Have happy holidays. We'll talk to you later, Mitch.
All right. Thanks, guys. Same to you.
See you, man.
We will be back.